Chapter 28. Boggarts and Horcruxes. When Severus left the staff meeting that night, he wasted no time in telling both the founders about Albus's drastic measures. Salazar nearly laughed himself silly over the fact that Albus considered acting like a Slytherin to be drastic measures, but in truth, he really wasn't surprised. Godric on the other hand, laughed and said he was astonished that Albus would stoop so low that he would even consider acting in a Slytherin manner. It was typical Albus overreacting to the silliest things, but at least everyone had a good laugh over it. However, despite their feelings for the headmaster, they did agree that this was a very good decision and they certainly weren't going to stand in the way of it. One thing they didn't laugh about was the fact that this meant they needed to implement the plan they had come up with for capturing Pettigrew. It wasn't a perfect plan as it was, and with time running out, Salazar was beating himself up over the fact that he had not started it sooner. It had already been 3 days since the attack, and Dowls had been coming and going ever since. After Poppy had filled her in about what was said that night, Minerva also encouraged Gryffindor to write letters to their parents as well. Rumor had it that the twins laid it on pretty thick in their letter, and Fudge was now walking around with his ears still ringing from the howl Molly Weasley had sent him. Harry Potter himself had added to the pressure of it all by sending Hedwig off with a letter of his own addressed to Fudge, and it was that letter that had been printed in Tuesday's morning edition of the Daily Prophet, much to Salazar's shock. Harry Potter speaks out about Dementor attack at Hogwarts. The following letter was addressed to Minister Fudge, and what the boy who lived has to say may shock and surprise you. Dear Minister Fudge, my name is Harry Potter, and I am a second-year Slytherin at Hogwarts. Rumors have been swirling for weeks that the Dementors have been put here to keep Sirius Black from murdering me in my sleep. Please pardon my unwavering opinion, but Minister, I find this absolutely appalling. As I'm sure you're aware, the Dementors came into the grounds Saturday afternoon and attacked the entire student body during a Quidditch match. Several students were nearly kissed, and I find myself shaking my head in shame that it even happened in the first place. If the rumors are true and it's because of your concern for my safety that these unrelenting beings are here, then I say they need to be removed from Hogwarts immediately. My safety is simply not worth putting the rest of the students in danger. Hogwarts is plenty safe enough without the added protection of the Dementors. Between the wards, enchantments, competent professors, magical children that can be found everywhere, and the headmaster, one raving lunatic doesn't stand a chance of even getting near me. Especially since we have Helga Hufflepuff's badgers to protect us all. Let me explain. You see, last year during the Halloween feast, someone let a troll into the castle as a joke. Word got out that it was here, and all students were sent to their houses as a precaution. Unfortunately, the troll was in the dungeon, and when Slytherin House was sent to our common room, we ran right into the fully grown beast. The protective magic of Helga Hufflepuff was activated, and every stone that the castle is made of turned solid black. The troll became stuck to the wall, as if pushed there by an unseen hand, and small yellow badgers appeared on every wall of the castle as they raced from every direction to annihilate the threat. And I do mean annihilate. I do not need to explain what a badger does to its prey. I'm sure you can imagine the scene that followed as the badgers attacked the troll, so I think it's safe to say that Sirius Black does not stand a chance against the Hufflepuff badgers. With that said, please take into consideration the removal of the Dementors. We really don't want to take the chance that they will attack the student population again. Sincerely, Harry James Potter. Readers, seeing as there have been many cries from concerned parents, and now with this letter from Harry Potter himself, we at the Daily Prophet are pleased to inform you that Minister Fudge has decided to remove the Dementors from Hogwarts. The Minster had this to say about the situation. I have looked at all the evidence and spoken with Dumbledore on many occasions. I feel confident that the school is safe without the added presence of the Dementors. Especially after the attack and having received the letter from Mr. Potter. The Dementors will be removed this coming Friday afternoon. What the minister had to say is reassuring, and we are happy that this situation has finally been resolved, but we at the Daily Prophet are now more interested in these Hufflepuff badges. If anyone has any information, please stop by our offices located in Diagon Alley. Well, you have certainly opened up a can of worms with that, Harry, Blaise said with a snicker as he took a sip of his morning pumpkin juice. Dumbledore doesn't look very happy with you at the moment. The three of them looked up from their usual places at the Slytherin table, and noticed that Albus was giving Salazar a very stern gaze. Salazar honestly couldn't understand why. He had not expected the minister to turn over his letter to the paper, but at least the combined efforts of all the students, parents, professors, and yes, even Harry Potter, had gotten the job done. Maybe he's upset because you didn't list him as a competent professor. Godric snorted, while trying to hide a smirk. Or maybe he's upset that you mentioned the troll incident. Perhaps, but you know what this means, don't you? Salazar asked, looking at Godric with a sigh. It means we will probably have to sit through another hour-long lecture tonight about how we are too young to get involved with such things, even though it was his idea to get the students involved in the first place. I know. It seems that our detentions with the headmaster are going to consist of nothing but lectures. I'd much prefer scrubbing the corridors with toothbrushes and being overseen by Mr. Filch. Blaise burst out laughing. You guys are weird. I'd much rather prefer the lectures. Not when someone is talking at you, Salazar replied. There is a difference between someone talking to you versus at you. To you is a conversation. At you can quickly turn into something with a condescending tone, for lack of a better explanation. Do I talk at you, speaker? Nora asked, as she and Hedwig shared her bowl of mice. Hedwig hooted softly and bobbed her head as Salazar grinned at her. All the time, my dear. The three of them began laughing as she hissed loudly. I wasn't talking to you, Pigeon, but I suppose someone has to keep speaker in line. Godric chuckled, but Blaise looked at him curiously. Gordy, did you understand her? Both Salazar and Godric looked at each other quickly, but then back at Blaise. Enough to know what she said, Godric said as he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He is coming along really well with his lessons. He doesn't have Fred and George in his class, Salazar answered with a snicker. Blaise eyed the two of them suspiciously, but then he smiled. I suppose you're right. Nora, how many times did you threaten to bite them if they didn't pay attention? Too many to count, Sababy, she said offhandedly as she ate. My dear, don't talk with your mouth full, it's unbecoming. She mumbled something that they didn't catch, but Salazar rolled his eyes and turned to Hedwig. Hedwig, I have a letter for you. You'll know who to take it to. She hooted knowingly, finished the last bit of her mouse, took the letter, and they watched as she flew away. Harry, I think it's time to get to class, Blaise said as he drained the last little bit of his pumpkin juice and stood up. Salazar sighed. Yeah, I think so. We have defense, and rumor has it Professor Lupin has a boggart. Interesting, Godric said with an intrigued expression. Any idea what you're afraid of? Salazar looked at Godric with a small smile. I used to, my friend, he said, as he patted Godric's shoulder meaningfully. Now though, I really can't say for sure. It should be interesting. Let me know, Godric replied with a knowing smile. Salazar nodded, and both he and Blaise left the Great Hall and began heading towards the defense classroom. As they walked along in silence, Blaise studied him out of the corner of his eye and wondered when Harry had ever come into contact with a boggart. Who can tell me what a boggart is and what it does? Remus asked, looking out over the seated class. Salazar smiled when, as usual, Hermione's hand sprang into the air. Miss Granger? She gave Remus a bright smile before launching into her answer. Boggarts turn into whatever you fear the most. No one knows what a boggart really looks like. Every good Miss Granger. 5 points to Gryffindor, Remus said with a nod. Now, I have managed to bring this wardrobe, which contains a boggart, into the classroom. I want all of you to stand up and move to the back of the class." They did, and Remus waved his wand at the desks, which made them scoot along towards the edges of the classroom. "Now," Remus continued as he paced the front of the room, "the best way to finish off a boggart is to turn it into something funny, because laughter is the only way to finish them off. The way to do this is to point your wand at it and say the incantation of ridiculous. Let's practice that a bit. Repeat after me. Ridiculous." Salazar secretly watched as they all repeated the wand movement and incantation. He was pleased to see that most of the students were doing it correctly. However, Crab and Goyle kept wanting to use their wands as swords. Neville, on the other hand, had a determined look on his face, and Salazar was happy to note that he was doing everything correctly. When they were done, Remus called for their attention and asked, "All right, who would like to go first?" It was no surprise that one volunteered, so Remus took it upon himself to choose. "Okay, Miss Granger, since you answered my question correctly, why don't you take a stab at it?" he asked with a gentle smile. Hermione took a deep breath, muttered something to herself, and stepped forward. Remus opened up the wardrobe with a flick of his wand, and to Salazar's surprise, Minerva stepped out. "Miss Granger, I had such high hopes for you, but you have greatly disappointed me. You have failed everything." Hermione yelped and then half-heartedly squeaked, "Ridiculous." Nothing happened, and the boggart Minerva smirked. "You're no good. You can't even." "Ridiculous." Hermione shouted with more force, and boggart Minerva stumbled backwards and landed hard on her bum. "Every good." Remus cried with a loud laugh. "Mr. Malfoy, you're next." "I can do better than the mudblood," he whispered to Pansy, who snorted. Salazar gave him a disapproving glare and had to restrain himself from hexing the brat. Draco stepped up to the boggart, which instantly turned into his father. Boggart Lucius was dressed in rags and he looked highly dirty and frumpled. "Son, we have no more money," he said in a raspy voice. "We have no more influence. It's gone. All gone." Draco stared at Boggart Lucius with wide eyes and paled drastically, but then he raised his wand. "Ridiculous!" he cried, and suddenly Boggart Lucius was standing there in gaudy, rich-looking robes. Draco laughed, along with several others, but most of the students rolled their eyes. "That was too easy," he said with a smirk. Several more people went next, and Salazar saw everything from banshees, which Nora thought was Molly Weasley's sister, to mummies, spiders, and snakes, which greatly amused her. When Neville's turn came, Salazar became alarmed when a sneering Bellatrix Lestrange suddenly appeared. Neville started shaking badly when she spoke. "Longbottom, want to end up like Mummy and Daddy?" she taunted in a little girlish voice. "Worthless blood traitor. You deserve it," she shouted. Salazar was ready to intervene, but at the last second he stopped when Neville drew himself up to his full height. "You'll never lay a hand on me or my family again," he yelled with confidence. "Ridiculous." Bellatrix suddenly stood there clad head to toe in red and gold robes, and she shrieked and began tap dancing around as if you get away from the offending colors. A triumphant smile appeared on his lips as the class roared with laughter. Then it continued on. Crabbe, Goyle, Pansy, and several Gryffindors found out that their greatest fear was Voldemort. To Salazar, the man looked just like he did at the end of the war. He was human, with dark grayish hair and red eyes, but he looked slightly disfigured because of the toll all the dark magic he performed had taken out on his body. With all of those that had Voldemort as a boggart though, Remus had to intervene because the children were reduced to tears. Blaise found out that his boggart was also Voldemort, and Remus made a move to intervene, but Blaise waved him off. "It's okay, Professor," he said with a shaky voice. "Let me try." Remus nodded and retreated back, and Salazar watched as Boggart Voldemort sneered at the young boy. "Worthless. How did you even get into Slytherin? Ridiculous, Blaze said, but the boggart continued teasing him. Can't even get rid of me. It laughed loudly. Pathetic. Yeah, well, Harry defeated you when he was a baby. You're nothing but a loser. Ridiculous, Blaze shouted, and instantly Boggart Voldemort turned into a ballerina. The whole class once again burst out laughing. Finally there were two people left, Ron and Salazar himself. Salazar was just stepping up to the boggart when Ron shoved him from behind. Move, Potter. He sneered. It's my turn. Salazar rolled his eyes and let the boy have his turn. When the boggart shifted, everyone was confused by it. It turned into a young, handsome boy with dark hair and dark cold eyes, but he was dressed in Ravenclaw robes. They will find out. I will tell them it was you. The boggart Ravenclaw said in a low threatening tone. Do as I say, or else. Salazar watched this confrontation with confusion, but Ron yelped and cried, ridiculous. The boggart was suddenly loaded down with heavy books and began to struggle under their weight, which caused many in the class to snort and giggle. Finally Salazar stepped up to it. A year ago, his boggart would have turned into a very angry Godric, who would have shouted that he would never forgive Salazar no matter what. Now however, he knew that wouldn't happen, and he was genuinely curious to find out what his greatest fear was. The boggart instantly turned into a dead Lily Potter, and Salazar stumbled backwards a bit in shock. Ridiculous, he shouted half-heartedly, and the boggart turned into a dead James. Remus's breath hitched in his throat, but Salazar quickly repeated the incantation, and this time the boggart turned into a dead Harry. Salazar was getting frustrated with himself, and once more shouted the spell only for the boggart to turn into a smirking Voldemort. You're too overconfident, he said with a sneer. Perhaps you're afraid that all your plans will fail, and I will find out your secret. Never, Salazar hissed in a tone laced with venom. We shall see, Boggart Voldemort hissed back. You're an insolent little whelp, and I cannot wait for the day when I can tell you that face to face. Who has been playing with whom today? Salazar asked with a smirk. I'm not afraid of you. So why are you here? Are you sure you're in control? Boggart Voldemort stumbled backwards and his face took on one of shock. Salazar waved his wand at a few thick piles of dust, and a laughing James, Lily, and Harry appeared. Ridiculous, Salazar shouted again, and suddenly Boggart Voldemort was on the floor covering his ears and cowering in fear. The class stood stunned. But Remus joined in with the laughing Dust Potters, and Hermione, Neville and Blaze quickly followed suit. After that, Remus banished the boggart back into the wardrobe so he could use it for his other classes. Salazar vanished the Dust Potters even though he was slightly shaken up. He had been bluffing, but the boggart Voldemort had a point. He was afraid that the real Voldemort would discover that he had hidden the Potters, and he didn't know what he would do if that ever happened. Did you see him with that boggart? Blaze asked quietly as he looked at Hermione and Neville. It was later that evening after dinner, and they were sitting in the inn library going over notes on boggarts so they could get started on the essay Remus set. Salazar and Godric were in detention with Albus, and Colin was doing his own homework with a few of his friends in Gryffindor Tower. I saw him, Neville said with a nod. But I wonder what VV. He took a deep breath and closed his eyes. Voldemort meant by a secret. I don't know, Blaze said as he shook his head. But it's curious, isn't it? Hermione kept her head down, but she nodded slightly. She had been thinking a lot about what she saw today, and she had an idea on what it could be. She knew that the man had to be his, or well, the real Harry's dad because they looked just alike. The boggart Harry might have been the real Harry because she noticed that he didn't have a scar, and the woman must have been his mum. If all that was true, then could Salazar's secret be that the real Harry Potter and his parents were alive and safe? She wasn't sure, but she was suddenly pulled out of her thoughts when Neville nudged her. And I think they may be hiding something. What? Hermione asked, suddenly startled. "Look at this chocolate frog card. Gordy, Harry, and I had a little fun with it, but it's Godric Gryffindor's. Take away the beard and long hair, and tell me what you see," Blaise said, sliding it across the table towards them. Hermione and Neville glanced at it, but it was Neville whose eyes widened in shock. "He looks like an older version of Gordy," he exclaimed in a breathless whisper. Blaise nodded and sighed deeply. "I know. I have a crazy and outlandish theory. I think Gordy is Godric Gryffindor. I mean, how many 11-year-olds have a phoenix that is bonded to them?" Hermione was not shocked by this declaration, but Neville's eyes widened even further. "But how is that possible?" Neville asked. "I don't know." "Hermione, what do you think?" Blaise asked, looking at her curiously. She sighed heavily, looked around cautiously, and then nodded. "I guess since you have figured it out, I might as well share what I know. I don't just think that Gordy is Godric Gryffindor. I also think that Harry is Salazar Slytherin himself." Blaise and Neville stared at her with blank expressions, but Blaise finally leaned back in his chair and nodded. "Now that you mention it, it doesn't seem so far-fetched, and it would explain a lot of things," he said thoughtfully as Hermione nodded. She went on to explain about the anagram she figured out, and all her thoughts on the subject. When she was done, Blaise let out a long breath it seemed he had been holding, but Neville just sat there in shock. "But how is that possible?" Neville asked again, still in a stupor of disbelief. "I don't know," Hermione said. "But I don't think we should let on that we know. They are hiding this for a reason, and it may cause them a lot of undue worry." "I agree with Hermione," Neville said, finally coming to his senses. "I do as well," Blaise replied with a nod. "Whatever this is for, we don't need to go blabbing, lest Harry turns us into frogs or something." Neville and Hermione chuckled, but Neville said, "I just can't believe two of my friends are founders." It's mind-boggling." Hermione finished with a nod. "I know. It's taken me this long to get my head around that fact. I'm sure someone must know who they are though." "Not Dumbledore, that's for sure," Neville said with a shake of his head. "I get the feeling that they don't like him very much." "I think you're right," Hermione agreed, and Blaise nodded. "I think Snape knows," he said with a knowing look. "You guys don't see them interact with him like do, but I think he knows." "How so?" Hermione asked, tilting her head to one side. "I don't know," he said with a shake of his head. "I can't explain it, but you would think that Salazar Slytherin of all people would let the head of Slytherin know he's here. Same goes for McGonagall and Godric Gryffindor." "Maybe," Hermione said unsure. "But it's not a lot to go on. I mean, Dumbledore is the headmaster, and I don't think he knows." "We may never know who knows," Neville replied. "But you have to look at the fact that there was all the rumors about how Snape hates Gryffindors and stuff. He's bad about bad-mouthing Gryffindors and insulting them, but he's not that bad. Even some of the older students say he's changed a bit. Do you think we should tell Colin?" he asked suddenly. Hermione immediately shook her head. "Colin is like a little brother to me, but I don't think we should. You know how hyper he gets, and he likes to talk a mile a minute about anything and everything. My mum would say that he doesn't have a filter on his mouth." "Hermione is right," Blaise said with a sigh. "I like Colin, but we can't risk him slipping up and saying something." "True," Neville agreed. Madame Pince, the librarian, suddenly swooped down on them from out of nowhere, and they cringed like mice caught in an owl's shadow. "You three have been whispering and talking the moment you set foot in here," she hissed as she glared at them with narrowed eyes. Out! 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 "You clearly don't want to study," she said, immediately hushing their protests. "This is the library, not the Great Hall." With a lot of grumbling from Neville and Blaise, and with an apologetic, sheepish look from Hermione, They quickly gathered up their stuff and scurried out of the library. When they reached the corridor, Blaze scowled at the doors as Madam Pince slammed them shut in their faces. "Well, that could have gone better," Neville said with a sigh. "Do you all want to find a nearby empty classroom?" "I guess so. Harry and Gordy said they would meet us here after their detention," Blaze answered, still scowling at the doors. "Oh, come on. We all know how Madam Pince is," Hermione said, grabbing his arm and dragging him away. They were only halfway down the corridor when Neville heard a voice that made him stop in his tracks. What was that? He thought, as he looked around in confusion. "I must find him. The one who speaks. Where is he? Where is he?" Neville turned sharply to face the wall and came face to face with a portrait of some bloodhounds carrying on with a fox hunt. "Hello?" Neville called out. Blaze and Hermione stopped and turned around. "Neville?" Hermione asked curiously. "What is it?" "I thought I heard something," he said in a confused voice as he stood there staring at the wall. "But I guess I must have imagined. The speaker, I must find him." This time all three of them stood stock still and stared at the wall. "Hello?" Neville called out again. "A speaker? Nora, are you in the wall playing tricks on us? We can hear you, you know." "You can hear me? You can understand me?" Neville chuckled a bit. "Of course we can hear and understand you, Nora. You are playing a joke, aren't you?" "My name is not Nora. I am Emeralda, Keeper of the Chamber of Secrets and Protector of Hogwarts." "Who are you?" All three of their mouths dropped open at once, and they all glanced at each other nervously. There was no doubt in their minds as to whom they were hearing. I am Neville Longbottom, and I'm here with my friends Hermione Granger and Blaze Zabini. Can we help you?" he asked tentatively. "Are you little ones?" "Little ones? I'm afraid we don't understand," Hermione asked with a shaky voice, as Blaze backed up a few steps. "Yes, little ones. Students?" Oh yes," Neville replied with a squeak. "We are second years. Hermione and I are Gryffindors to be exact, and Blaze is a Slytherin." "You all sound afraid, little Neville Longbottom. I can hear it in your voices. Please don't be. You have nothing to fear from me. Can you tell me where the speaker is? His name is Harry Potter. I have heard he speaks my language. I have something important to tell him." Okay, Emeralda. We are friends of Harry's. He taught us how to understand Parseltongue, though we can't speak it. Harry is up in the headmaster's tower serving detention," Neville replied. "I cannot get to the headmaster's tower from my position. You must lead the way, little one, and get this Harry Potter to a place where I can talk to him. I will follow you." The three of them glanced nervously at one another again. "What do we do?" Neville asked in a barely audible whisper. I. Hermione stammered, but Blaze spoke up. "We should take the giant snake to him. It is his snake after all," he said with wide eyes, as he stared at the wall. "But what could all this mean?" Hermione asked fretfully. "Hello? Little ones? Have you gone off without me?" No, Neville replied. "We are still here." Blaze shrugged as if to say I don't know what to do, but Neville took a deep breath. "Just follow our voices. We will lead you to just outside the gargoyle that guards the tower. I cannot get there as easily as you can, but I know where it is. I will meet up with you there." "Okay," Neville said slowly, still not knowing if this was the right thing to do. It took them a good 10 minutes to get to the gargoyle from the library, and when they arrived Neville began checking to see if Emeralda had made it yet, while Hermione and Blaze figured out what to do next. "I think we need to get to Harry right away," Hermione said as she looked at Blaze. "I agree, but I don't know about barging into the headmaster's office. Maybe we should wait until they come down. But this is important. He needs to know now. Hermione cried in a loud whisper. Do you know the password? No. Blaise replied, shaking his head. But rumor has it that Dumbledore likes candy, and that his password is always some type of candy. Hermione's eyes lit up and she turned to face the gargoyle. Skittles. She blurted out, but the gargoyle just stared at her. M&Ms? Chocolate-covered cherries? Milk duds? Gobstoppers? Fruit roll-ups? What are those? Blaise asked, utterly confused. You said candy. She said defensively. That's candy. Not any candy I have heard of. It must be mull, but let me try wizard candy. Blaise said with an amused snort. Acid pops? Chocolate frogs? Ice mice? Fizzing whizbees? Jelly slugs? Pumpkin fizz? Pumpkin. May I ask why you all are so desperate to gain entry into Headmaster's Tower? A deep, seemingly bored voice asked from behind them. They all yelped in surprise, and whipped around to find Severus smirking at them. What's the matter? Can Potter not function without you all stuck to him? It's bad enough that Ruffin, the giant snake, is on her way here. Blaise blurted out desperately. We need to find Harry. She's asking for him because he speaks Parseltongue. Severus's jaw stiffened as his dark eyes studied the young boy, but then he turned to the gargoyle. Sugar quills, he said, then he turned to the children. Stay put, he ordered, as the gargoyle moved aside. Severus quickly made his way up the stairs, but when he reached the door to Albus's office he took a deep breath and knocked. Come in, Albus called out. Severus entered and quickly scanned the room. Salazar and Godric were glaring daggers at the headmaster, but Albus was sitting there with a gentle smile on his face. Severus, can I help you? Yes, headmaster. It seems that we have an issue, he said slowly. Longbottom, Granger, and Zarbini are in the corridor, and they say that the giant snake is waiting for Potter. He sneered. Albus's gentle smile instantly vanished, but both Salazar and Godric's bolted from their chairs, rushed past Severus, and ran down the stairs. They were halfway down when they heard Albus yelling something, but they paid no attention. When they got into the corridor, Blaise, Hermione, and Neville turned around quickly and pointed toward the wall. She's just behind the wall, Neville said, backing away as Salazar glanced over them. Are you all okay? He asked, just as Albus and Severus exited the gargoyle. Blaise took a deep breath and nodded. Yeah, Harry, we are. Her name is Emeralda, and she actually seems pretty nice. I don't know why she wants to talk to you though. I didn't even think to ask, Hermione said, leaning against the wall and shaking her head. I was just so shocked. Neville finished, and she nodded. Salazar started to smile, but caught himself and nodded instead. He wasn't surprised about that, and he wished he could have warned them about possibly encountering Emeralda. He had already gone back down into the chamber and explained everything in detail to her. She knew who the children, Severus, and Albus were, and why Salazar was in the position he was in. However, if she was looking for him, that meant the boy had shown up again. Emeralda? He asked tentatively. Young speaker, at last. I called for you because I know you speak my language, and I am more comfortable talking to you because of that. As the other little one said, my name is Emeralda. Please don't be afraid, I won't hurt you. All right. What do you wish to tell me? Salazar asked, hoping that she had some new information for him. A little red-headed boy came to see me just a little while ago. He woke me up from my slumber. He told me things about you, and that is how I know you can speak. He wanted me to hunt down moles, but then told me to find you and kill you. Rest assured, I will not do this. I also don't think there are any moles here. I think I'm being tricked. I hear no shouts or yelling, nor do I smell fear. Emeralda said angrily. You are being tricked. There are no moles here. Can you tell me anything more about this red-headed boy? Salazar asked. He's gangly looking. Very thin and very angry. He's just like the one before him, but there is evil about him. He doesn't seem himself. How do you mean? Salazar asked with a puzzled expression. He can only speak my language if he is holding a book in his hands. It's a black book, and he says he is just doing what another boy tells him to. His eyes, though, look haunted and dark. Almost as if he is not in control of his actions. What is the other boy's name? Salazar asked. He knew this was new information that Emeralda didn't have last time, and he was once again glad that he had told her to closely pay attention the next time this mystery redhead came to her. The red-headed boy calls this other boy his friend, and his name is Tom Riddle. Salazar's blood ran cold as all his fears were confirmed. Voldemort, through the actions of Lucius Malfoy, was somehow involved, but he still did not know how. Albus, on the other hand, began staring up at the ceiling in thought, and Salazar knew him well enough by now to know exactly what Albus was thinking. Redhead, Black Book, and involved with Voldemort. It could only be a Slytherin, in Albus's mind, and that meant Godric. He just rolled his eyes and turned back to the wall. Emeralda, is there anything else at all you can tell me? Did he say anything else about Tom Riddle? Salazar asked, and he noticed that Albus looked at him with a sharp calculating gaze. Many years ago, another boy came to me and told me there were moles attacking the school. This new red-headed boy said that this Tom Riddle, whoever he is, was the same boy. Did he say this in Parseltongue or English? English, she replied. What more can you say about this black book? Albus asked curiously. There was a long pause, but Salazar broke it by saying, Emeralda, the headmaster asked the question and it is a valid one. Can you tell us anything about it? Only that it sometimes glows. The glow enters the red-headed boy and suddenly he changes. He can speak our language then. That is when he acts like the other boy. How does he act when this glow leaves him? Albus asked. Like an angry boy. Always angry, always talking bad about the young speaker. He told me about a joke that was played a few nights ago. He told me you were making fun of me, she said in a hurt tone. No, my dear, we were not making fun of you. We were making light of the fact that the whole school, though it was me who was setting you free, and having you attack people. We did it to make people laugh at that fact only. A prank then? Emeralda said with an amused hiss. Just like my master Salazar and his best friend Godric long ago. I do not take offense then. Salazar, nor the other adults, saw the children exchange amused glances and smiles, but Salazar chuckled and placed a hand on the wall. Never would we insult you, Emeralda. I should not have thought otherwise, little one. It was my mistake, she said kindly. Is there any more that you can tell us? What exactly does this red-headed boy say about me? He always calls you a stupid Slytherin, attention-seeking, and something called a prat. Sounds just like Ron Weasley, Neville said, chuckling lightly. Hermione gasped and her hand flew to her mouth as Salazar whipped around to face them. Neville, will you find Fred and George and bring them here? Quickly, please. He asked with an urgent pleading glance. Neville nodded and quickly took off down the corridor before Albus could stop him. Harry, do you really think it could be Ron? Blaise asked breathlessly as he nervously searched Salazar's face. I don't know, he answered, as he began pacing the corridor. A tentative plan began to form in his mind as they all stood in the corridor outside the gargoyle, but this had to be played out very carefully. He knew Albus had a slew of questions, so he decided to answer some of them. Even if all the answers were a lie. Gordy, we need Nahum. Can you call for him? Severus and Godric stared at him with wide eyes as they both began trying to figure out what he was up to, but Godric did call for him. Meanwhile, Severus cast several privacy wards around the area. When Nahum appeared and landed on Godric's shoulder, Albus drew himself up to his full height and seemed to study the bird closely. Salazar took a spare bit of parchment and a quill out of his pocket, scribbled a note, and handed it to Nahum. "Gordy, can a phoenix deliver a letter to someone even though they may not know the person or where that person lives?" "Yes," Godric answered simply, still trying to figure out where Salazar was going with this. "Good. Nahum, will you please take this letter to Nicholas Flamel?" Severus's mouth nearly hit the floor, but he was able to retain his usual bored look, while Albus stared at Salazar in shock. Nahum disappeared, and once again, Salazar resumed his pacing. His mind was in overdrive and he needed to think, but this was difficult to do seeing as Albus began asking questions. "Mr. Ruffin, where did you acquire your phoenix?" "On a hiking trip with my family. I had slipped and fell several feet down a mountainside when he appeared and helped me. He has stayed with me ever since," Godric lied. Albus seemed to study him for a moment, but then his attention turned towards Blaise and Hermione, who were still standing there listening to every word. "Perhaps you all should head to your common rooms. There is no need for you to stay here." "I insist they stay," Emeralda suddenly replied. "They are the young speaker's friends, and they may make him more comfortable. I get the feeling you don't like the young speaker very much." "That is not true, gentle Great Snake. I care for Harry very much," Albus replied kindly. Salazar and Godric snorted loudly, which made Albus glare at them. Hermione and Blaise, however, exchanged smiles as they tried to make themselves less visible. They really wanted to stick around for whatever was about to come. Albus sighed heavily, but turned his attention to Salazar. "Harry, how do you know Nicholas Flamel?" Salazar pretended not to hear him, so Albus repeated his question, but this time he was interrupted by the arrival of Nicholas and Nahum. Salazar didn't waste any time. "Mr. Flamel, thank you for coming so quickly," Salazar said breathlessly and as innocently as he could. "I know that we just met this past summer, and I thank you and Mrs. Flamel so much for taking me into your home, but I have a problem and need your assistance. I was hoping you could help." Nicholas smiled with amusement and shot a glance at a completely gobsmacked Albus before speaking. "Harry, Perenelle and I told you before you left, that if at any time you needed us, especially here," he added dryly, "that one of us would come. What is it that you need my help with?" Salazar smirked slightly at Nicholas's jab at Albus, but he tried to keep his voice even and calm. "I believe Tom Riddle is here, but I don't know how and I don't know why. I know I have written and told you all about this chamber nonsense, but it seems as if he's behind it. The giant snake is here, just beyond the wall, and has given us some clues as to why this is happening." "What clues?" Nicholas asked with a frown. Salazar began to explain what Emeralda had told them. Some of this Nicholas knew from the letters, but the information about the Black Book left him stumped. "Without this book to study, Harry, I cannot say for sure," he answered gravely. "I would need to see it." Do you think it could be one of those things you mentioned to me?" Salazar asked with wide innocent eyes. He didn't know for sure if this Black Book was a Horcrux, but from what Emeralda described, it could be. He knew Voldemort wasn't outright possessing Ron, seeing as Ron wasn't sporting a turban this year, but he decided to take a stab in the dark and see what would come of this. Not to mention, he wanted to see what Albus would do. Both Nicholas and Albus paled drastically, though for very different reasons. However, for his part, Nicholas knew exactly what Salazar was doing, and was more than happy to play along. "Nicholas, you told him?" Albus shouted. "How could you?" "The boy needed to know," Nicholas replied with a calm smile. "And I have yet to hear of you getting off your bum and doing anything about them. He knows exactly who Tom Riddle is, and that he could possibly have made Horcruxes." "Why?" Albus asked, growing red in the face as he glared at his former friend. Because, as I said, Harry needed to know. He needs to know what he's up against, Albus. Nicholas replied calmly. You keep insisting on keeping him in the dark, but I would think after last year, you'd be happy about this news. Albus gritted his teeth and tried to calm himself down, but everyone present knew that it was getting harder for him to do that. Please tell me you haven't told him about it. If by it you mean the prophecy, no I haven't, and I'd be willing to swear you an oath to prove it, Nicholas said truthfully, with a slight smirk. What prophecy? Salazar asked immediately, with his eyes bouncing back and forth between the two of them. Godric, who was standing a few feet behind Albus, was grinning and desperately trying not to laugh. Severus was watching the whole thing with his usual blank expression. Albus, on the other hand, glared at Nicholas. Don't worry about that, Harry. You're too young to be involved as it is. Nicholas chuckled. You think too lowly of him, Albus. He is a very bright boy. Will you tell me, Mr. Flamel? Salazar asked, but then shook his head no ever so slightly. Albus didn't catch the movement because he was too busy glaring daggers at Nicholas, but Nicholas did, and he smiled at Salazar. One thing at a time, Harry. I hope you trust me enough to know when it is the right time to tell you. I do trust you, sir, and I understand, Salazar said with an air of disappointment, as Albus sighed in visible relief. Just then, they heard breathless panting coming from the end of the corridor as Neville, Fred, and George arrived. Both Fred and George looked so frantic as they came to a stop in front of Salazar, that they didn't even notice Nicholas was there. Harry, Neville filled us in. You can't be serious about Ron and the Black Book. Fred gasped as he doubled over in pain from running. We aren't sure, Salazar said with a heavy sigh, then he looked apologetically at all the children. I'm so sorry, but what I'm about to say may come as a shock to you. The only reason Fred and George do is because they caught me. Everyone looked confused by that, but Albus raised a critical eyebrow and glared at him. Fred, George, do you remember the night that you two caught me wandering around close to curfew talking to a house elf? Yes, they both said together, trying to figure out where this was going. Remember what that house elf said about who we later figured out was Lucius Malfoy? Think, has your family recently come in contact with Lucius Malfoy? Yes, Fred said, as George's eyes widened in alarm. Oh no, George said, as his eyes nearly filled with genuine tears. Harry, I don't know why I didn't think of this before. We should have remembered this, Fred. He cried as he slid down the wall and onto the floor. Then he looked up at Salazar with a face full of desperation. Listen, Harry, over the summer during our school shopping trip to Diagon Alley, we were waiting in Flourish and Blots for Mum to get an autograph from Lockhart the fraud. We, meaning Fred, Ron, Ginny, and I were coming out of the shop when we ran into Lucius and Draco Malfoy. Ron started his usual prattle of Slytherins are the devil and Draco went on about how poor we are. Ron threw down his cauldron, which was full of books, and went after Draco, but was stopped when Lucius poked the end of his walking cane in Ron's face. Then Lucius bent down and began helping Ron put his books back into the cauldron. That's when Dad showed up. More words were exchanged and Dad and Lucius actually got into a fist fight which caused the manager to throw us all out. He said, running his fingers through his hair. What about the Black Book? Did you see it? Nicholas asked in alarm. Lucius Malfoy does not bend down for anything. Fred nodded in agreement, but then looked at Nicholas. Now that I'm thinking about it, I do recall Ron saying something about an extra book in his cauldron when we got home, but I didn't apostrophe T. I didn't pay any attention though, he said with a sigh. I didn't see Lucius put anything in Ron's cauldron, but then again, this is Lucius we are talking about. George said. Harry, do you remember what the elf said about Lucius saying he will get what's coming to him? Salazar stared at him curiously and nodded. What if he didn't mean Professor Dumbledore like we thought? What if the elf meant my dad? George continued. I don't understand. What would? Salazar began, but he was cut off. Arthur Weasley's Mole Protection Act, Nicholas said suddenly, as Fred and George nodded and pointed at him. Salazar looked at him oddly. What? Nicholas shook his head. I'll explain what it is later, but suffice to say, if this black book is what we think it is, then placing a very dark object such as a Horcrux into the hands of Arthur Weasley's son would give Lucius the political upper hand. Especially if his son is setting loose a giant snake in the hopes that it will kill Muggleborns. It would send a signal that Arthur wasn't all that friendly towards them, and his Mole Protection Act would fail. Remind me to pay closer attention to politics. I've always hated them, Salazar said, rolling his eyes. Yes, I know, Nicholas replied with a grin. Salazar chuckled, but began pacing the corridor again as his brain processed this new information. Every eye was glued to him, except Albus, who looked lost in thoughts of his own. All that Nicholas said made perfect sense though. It would explain why the castle was sending out warnings, and a Horcrux is certainly dark enough to be picked up by Godric's detection ward. Young Harry, what have I taught you? Think out loud so that I can try to help. Salazar smiled because Nicholas was really getting into this role. He knew Nicholas could be a bit petty at times, and right now Salazar knew he was enjoying having the upper hand on Albus. Percy told me that Ron has been acting strange this year. He seems more angry than usual, and has basically cut himself off from the rest of his family because of the way they have embraced me. Ron would never do that willingly though. Fred interjected. Salazar nodded and continued. Percy thought it was the pressures of second year getting to him, and said that he has been writing in a black book. Ginny said it was actually a diary he keeps. Who here has ever known Ron Weasley to actually write when not told to do so? That's right. Hermione suddenly exclaimed, but then she clamped her hands over her mouth. That's all he does. Neville confirmed. He sits in the corner of the common room and scribbles in a black book. He's always scowling and muttering to himself about how he hates Harry. Hermione and I have tried to talk to him, but he brushes us off. He says he doesn't want to talk to Slytherin lovers. Hermione added quietly. Fred, we are horrible brothers. We haven't paid any attention to him. George said as tears began to spill down his cheeks. I didn't even notice. No, George, don't blame yourself for this. It's not your fault, Salazar said, kneeling in front of him. Look at me, we had no way of knowing about this until now. We should have thought of this earlier, Fred said, sitting beside his brother, who was still on the floor. What do we do, Harry? George asked desperately, looking into Salazar's eyes. This is a big leap filled with many circumstances. Albus scoffed. We have no way of knowing if any of this is true. Don't you dare doubt the young speaker, Emeralda shouted, and everyone jumped a bit when the wall she was behind shook slightly. Salazar knew she must have thrown her head against it and he chuckled. She was always a bit overprotective of him. He collected himself though, and glared at Albus. Why, because Ron is a Gryffindor? Salazar asked. I saw the look on your face earlier. Red hair, black book, working with Voldemort. Your mind automatically went to Gordy because he's a Slytherin, but tell me, Headmaster, how badly did that come crashing down when you learned he has a phoenix? He spat. Albus glared at him. You have no idea. Voldemort? Blaise, Neville, and Hermione cried together. What I'm talking about because I'm too young, too innocent, blah, 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 Salazar said, ignoring the children and finishing Albus's sentence. Yes, we know that already. He added sarcastically. Nicholas chuckled lightly. I told you not to underestimate him, Albus, and it seems that his friends are just as quick as he is. He said, then he turned to the children. Yes, Tom Riddle and Voldemort are one in the same. Tom Riddle is the heir of Slytherin, which is something I have been able to uncover with simple research. This is still all just hearsay and we are jumping to conclusions," Albus said angrily. "We have no way of knowing if Mr. Weasley is carrying around a Horcrux. Why don't you storm Gryffindor Tower and demand to see Ron's diary then? We all know you have a habit of doing that," Godric said dryly. "Yes, thank you for your insightful input, Godric," Salazar said sarcastically, trying to keep himself from laughing, but Godric grinned that foolish grin of his and Salazar couldn't help but snort. "All right, this stops now," Albus cried. "No more Salazar this and Godric that. Neither of you are anything like the founders." "How would you know? Did you know Godric Gryffindor?" Godric asked with his eyes shining with laughter. "Because you could be wrong." Albus glared at him, but Salazar laughed. "And I thought Salazar was an evil, bitter old man." Salazar snorted. "Hey, according to some people, that's right up my alley. Except for the bitter and old part," Godric added. "He was evil, well according to history anyway." "And whose fault is that?" Salazar asked, looking pointedly at Godric. "I can't remember. I must have amnesia," Godric replied with a grin. "Merlin help us," Nicholas said with a chuckle, as he shook his head and stared at the ceiling. "Headmaster, if I may," Severus began, trying to steer the conversation back to the topic at hand. He was well aware of how Salazar and Godric could be if the two of them got going. Perhaps there is some merit to what has been said here tonight. That stopped all the laughter immediately, and every eye landed on him. "You know something?" Albus asked in alarm. "Perhaps," he replied, glancing sharply at everyone as if to dare them to ask what he might know. Salazar certainly wanted to, but not here. He knew Severus would tell him later. He sighed heavily and looked over at the twins. They were smiling, but they didn't look like their usual selves when he and Godric started their playful bickering. Salazar could have kicked himself though. Now was not the time to be cracking jokes. He walked over to the wall and gently laid his hand upon it. "Emeralda, are you still here?" "Yes, young speaker, and I have been listening closely. What is it that you need? If this boy returns to you, will you let me know?" "Of course. Do you wish me to return to my sleep now?" "Yes, if that is where you came from," Salazar answered simply. "Very well. I will seek you out if he returns. Good night, young speaker, and young speaker's friends." They all mumbled a good night to her, but then Salazar took a moment to glance at the children. Blaise, Neville, and Hermione were leaning against the wall. Blaise was studying Salazar, but Neville and Hermione appeared to be lost in thought. Fred and George were still sitting on the floor, leaning against one another. "What about Ron?" Fred asked, after a few moments of silence. Salazar turned around to face him, but shook his head sadly. "I honestly don't know, Fred," he said, shifting his gaze to Nicholas in a silent plea for help. He knew what needed to be said, but under these circumstances, he shouldn't be the one saying them. "Horcruxes are very dangerous dark magical objects," Nicholas said seriously, coming to his rescue. "I will not go into details about what they are or what they are used for, but I will tell you to be careful. Now is not a time for pranks, jokes, or anything of the like. If any of you Gryffindors see Ron with this book in the common room, do not approach him on your own. Do not ask him questions, do ask to see it, and under no circumstances are you to try and touch it." "I know what a Horcrux is," George said. "Harry mentioned them last Christmas after he found that book. It is something to do with a soul and killing someone, but I can't really remember," he said, rubbing his forehead tiredly. "Oh yeah, I did. I had forgotten about that," Salazar said, remembering the scene last year when he basically told his heir that he was an idiot. "Well, regardless of whether you know what a Horcrux is or not, I agree with Nicholas," Albus said, glancing around at them. "If this truly is a Horcrux, then Mr. Weasley may be in serious danger and the situation will need to be looked at very closely. Messrs. Weasley, I know he is your brother, but you must hold yourselves back from doing anything. What about our mum and dad? Shouldn't they know about this? George asked. I will speak to them, Albus answered. They nodded, but Godric looked confused and he spoke up. I have a question. If Ron is so anti-anything Slytherin, then why is he helping Voldemort to do this? I truly don't understand the logic here. Wouldn't he suspect something? Fred sighed and shook his head. No offense to our baby brother, but Ron is somewhat thick. He may not know. His boggart. Hermione suddenly blurted out. Hermione? Salazar asked curiously. What does that have to do with? His boggart was dressed in Ravenclaw robes. Don't you remember? His boggart said I will tell them it was you. Do as I say, or else. I think he's being tricked. The odd scene replayed itself in Salazar's head, and suddenly it all made sense to him. Only you could put that together, Hermione, Neville said, shaking his head. It didn't occur to me either. Blaise agreed with a nod. That was brilliant, Hermione. It truly was, but this answers something that has honestly been bugging me for a while. Do you all remember the Halloween feast? Remember how Ron jumped up and began screaming hysterically and accusing Harry of setting loose the giant snake? Yes. They all chorused. I think that's why he did it. Blaise continued. I think he knows it was him, and he was afraid that he would get into trouble. We didn't know Luna's condition at the time, and the whole school thought she was dead. I think Ron thought that too. That's why he put all the blame on Harry. I agree. This all is starting to make perfect sense, Salazar said, which caused Hermione to blush and Blaise to smile softly. Then he looked at Severus, Albus, and Nicholas. I think they are right. He added gravely. Well, he wouldn't be the first person to be tricked by Voldemort, that's for sure, Nicholas said. So what are you all going to do about Ron? What's the plan? George asked, looking to Nicholas and Salazar for answers. I know this is not something you want to hear, Mr. Weasley, but we don't know, Nicholas said with a sigh, and Salazar confirmed it with a slight nod. Each Horcrux is different because most have very dark charms and enchantments that have been placed on them. Some could outright possess a person, some could kill a person if they touch it, and others could influence a person, which I think may be the case here. It will take a bit of time to work out a plan, and we have to make sure that we know exactly what we are dealing with. For instance, if we were to simply steal this book away from your brother, it may drive him insane. It could kill him, or any number of nasty things. This situation needs to be handled with extreme caution. In other words, now is not the time to be a typical Gryffindor, Godric said seriously, as he folded his arms across his chest. Normally that would make the twins giggle and laugh, but knowing that this was a serious issue they just nodded and looked at Godric sadly. I actually happen to agree with you, Ruffin, Severus said, though there was no underlying amusement to his statement. Now is not the time to go rushing in without using your heads. As a matter of fact, you are to do nothing and say nothing about this situation at all. If Mr. Weasley gets any idea that we know what we know, this could put him in danger, or he may simply get rid of the book, which would make it nearly impossible to track down. What about watching him? Fred asked. And should we let Percy know? No. Salazar, Severus, Nicholas, and Godric said together, which seemed to startle Albus a bit. Blaise, Hermione, and Neville on the other hand, glanced at one another, and Blaise slightly jerked his head in Severus's direction as if to say, I told you he knows. No one but the three of them noticed it though. Watching him may be a good idea, Severus added. But do not be obvious about it. You are to let us know if his behavior changes at all. Whether that changes for better or worse, we must know about it. Yes, sir. Fred and George mumbled. Albus, Despite our falling out last year, I'm willing to work with you on this. A young man's life is at stake here, Nicholas said, looking right at Albus. Albus glared at him and his jaw muscles stiffened as he gritted his teeth. Very well, he said in a curt tone. Salazar rolled his eyes. He knew Albus didn't like the fact that Nicholas was involved at all, but that was one of the reasons he brought Nicholas in. Albus wanted to be in charge of this situation, and while Albus would tell Severus everything he knew, Severus, given his position, wouldn't be able to keep Albus in line. Nicholas, however, could and would do just that. The last thing they needed is for Albus to somehow twist this into a situation for the greater good. The meeting broke up shortly after that, and Albus sent them all to their common rooms. Nicholas left via Nahum, and Albus retreated up the stairs and back into his office with Severus following behind him. Salazar, however, was tired and ready for bed. All of this new information had set his mind reeling, and he needed time to process it all. His plate was quickly getting full. Between this situation with the Horcrux and dealing with Pettigrew, he was quickly becoming overwhelmed, and he knew that both situations needed to be handled very carefully, yet quickly.
Hey guys, what's going on? Thank you so much for watching today's episode. If you guys want to watch more like it, please subscribe to my channel and become part of the video game fanfiction plot. And please leave a comment down below and hit that like button. If you guys have any suggestions on any stories you guys want me to read, don't hesitate. They're always welcome here in the video game fanfic plot. That also goes for video games. Until next time, goodbye!